March 1991. Bally's Casino in Las Vegas. The last time he would ever stand on a stage. He was 73 years old, and the tuxedo that once made him look like he owned the world now hung on him like borrowed clothes. 2,000 people held their breath, waiting for the magic, waiting for that effortless smile, that careless shrug, that voice that could make heartbreak sound like a lullaby. But something was different. The band started playing Everybody Loves Somebody, and when Dean opened his mouth, the voice that had serenaded presidents and broken hearts across 5 decades came out smaller than it should have. Quieter. There was a tremor there that hadn't been there before, a fragility that made the front row lean forward, concerned. His hand, the one that had held 1,000 microphones with casual grace, tightened around the stand just enough for his pianist to notice. Dean kept singing. Of course he did. Because that's what Dean Martin did. He made the impossible look easy. He made pain look like a party. He made dying look like dancing. What the audience didn't know, what almost no one would know for years, was that Dean Martin was already carrying a secret that would have broken a lesser man. Not the secret of his stage persona, though that was burden enough. Not the secret of his grief over his son's death 4 years earlier, though that wound had never healed. This was something deeper, something terminal that was quietly eating him alive from the inside out, and he refused to let anyone see it. The man who had spent his entire life hiding behind a glass of apple juice disguised as whiskey was now hiding something far heavier. In doctors' offices that he visited alone, he was receiving news that would send most people screaming into the night. His body, the vessel that had carried him through poverty, fame, divorce, and devastating loss, was finally surrendering. But Dean Martin, the king of cool, made a decision that night that revealed the true cost of his legendary grace. He chose silence. Not the silence of denial or fear, but the silence of protection. He looked at that audience, at the world that needed him to be their symbol of effortless cool, and he decided to carry this burden alone, because that's what heroes do, not the loud ones who demand attention or sympathy, the quiet ones, the ones who carry their pain like a secret, who protect everyone around them from the weight of their own breaking. He walked off that stage for the last time, brushed off the concerned questions with a joke and a pat on the shoulder, and began the longest performance of his life, convincing the world he was fine while he was quietly dying inside. Dean Martin spent his life making the difficult look easy, but stories like this reveal the heavy cost of that cool. If you want to keep the memory of the true Rat Pack alive, consider supporting the channel by buying me a coffee using the link in the description. Your support helps us uncover these lost legends. Now, let's go back to 1917, to a cold water flat in Steubenville, Ohio, where a boy named Dino Crescetti learned that silence could be the strongest form of love. The winter of 1917 came hard to Steubenville, Ohio, and it came hardest to the families who spoke broken English and carried names that twisted American tongues. In a cramped cold water flat above a butcher shop, a 6-year-old boy named Dino Crescetti was learning the most important lesson of his life, though he wouldn't understand its terrible weight for decades. His father Gaetano stood 16 hours a day over a barber's chair, hands moving with the precision of a craftsman and the exhaustion of an immigrant who understood that dignity had to be earned twice and questioned always. His mother Angela filled their rooms with the smells of tomatoes and starch, washing other people's clothes while her own hands cracked from the cold. English came to their household in fragments. Outside, it came back as insults. Wop. Dago. Go back where you came from. Dino watched everything with those dark eyes that seemed too old for his face. He watched his father come home with bruised knuckles from fights he never talked about, washing his hands in silence before kissing his children goodnight. He watched his mother scrub clothes until her fingers bled, then hide her hands behind her back when neighbors passed. They never complained. They never asked for help. They carried their humiliation like a private burden, protecting their children from the weight of it. The defining moment came on a February afternoon when ice formed on the inside of their windows. Dino had walked to his father's barber shop after school, sitting quietly in the corner while Gaetano worked. His father had been coughing for weeks, a deep rattling sound that seemed to come from somewhere dark inside his chest. That day, in the middle of giving a shave to a steel mill foreman, Gaetano simply stopped. The straight razor clattered to the floor. He gripped the barber chair with both hands, his face going gray, and for a terrible moment, Dino thought his father was dying right there in front of him. The foreman jumped up, half his face covered in shaving cream, shouting for someone to call a doctor. But Gaetano straightened slowly, picked up the razor, and with hands that trembled only slightly, finished the shave. He worked the rest of the day. When they walked home together that evening under the yellow glow of a streetlight, Dino asked the question that had been burning in his throat for hours. Why didn't you stop? Why didn't you let them help? His father stopped walking. In that weak light, Gaetano looked ancient, worn down to something essential and unbreakable. He put his hand on his son's shoulder and delivered the words that would echo through every stage Dino would ever stand on. A man carries his troubles quietly. You don't burden others with what you can handle alone. They have enough problems. You make them comfortable. You make them forget their own pain. That's what a man does. In that moment, under a Steubenville streetlight, a boy absorbed a lesson that would become both his greatest strength and his deepest burden. Pain was private. Suffering was not to be shared. You protect the people you love from your darkness by flooding them with light. By the time Dino Crocetti became Dean Martin, the lesson from that winter night had hardened into law. He had learned to make suffering look like ease, to make burden look like grace, to carry the weight of the world while convincing everyone around him that he was floating effortlessly above it all. But masks have a cost, and Dean Martin would spend his entire life paying it right up until his final breath, protecting everyone he loved from the knowledge that he was breaking inside. Because decades earlier, in a little Ohio barbershop, a boy had been taught that silence was not weakness, it was love. By the time the world discovered Dean Martin in the golden glow of the 1950s, the boy from Steubenville had already perfected the most audacious magic trick in show business history. He had convinced America that he was the luckiest drunk who ever lived, a man who stumbled out of bed, poured a scotch, and accidentally fell into stardom. At the Copa in New York and the Sands in Las Vegas, under lights that could melt steel, audiences watched him wander on stage a half step behind the beat, tie loose, tuxedo jacket hanging open like he'd borrowed it from a bigger man. He'd fiddle with the microphone as if he'd never seen one before, laugh at his own missed lyrics, and toss off jokes about being loaded. The crowd relaxed instantly. This wasn't some untouchable virtuoso. This was proof that genius could be casual, that talent was something you were born with, not something you had to bleed for. But every single moment was a lie, a beautiful, meticulously crafted lie that required more discipline than any honest performance ever could. The truth lived in the shadows behind the curtain, known only to the musicians who arrived for 8 o'clock rehearsals to find Dean already there, stone-cold sober, running through arrangements with surgical precision. The amber liquid in his glass wasn't whiskey. It was apple juice, maybe ginger ale on a wild night. While Sinatra and Sammy Davis Jr. lived the lifestyle they sang about, often hungover and unpredictable, Dean hovered at the edge of chaos without ever falling in. He was a surgeon disguised as a clown, rehearsing his stumbles until they looked like happy accidents, practicing his forgetfulness until it felt spontaneous. He understood something profound about the human heart that his contemporaries missed. People don't fall in love with perfection. Perfection creates distance, makes audiences feel small and inadequate. But the guy who trips over the microphone stand, who laughs at himself, who makes million-dollar productions look like a casual Friday night with friends, that guy becomes family. Dean worked twice as hard as anyone else to make sure no one ever saw him sweat, because he was giving them the gift of believing that somewhere in this grinding world, life could be effortless. The real Dean Martin revealed himself in the spaces between takes, When the cameras stopped rolling and the audience went home, during a tense rehearsal for his variety show in 1963, a young production assistant named Tommy accidentally knocked over a microphone stand during a quiet ballad, sending feedback shrieking through the studio. The director, already behind schedule and over budget, exploded. He began humiliating the kid in front of the entire cast and crew, his voice echoing off the soundstage walls like a public execution. Tommy stood there shaking, tears threatening, his career likely over before it had begun. Dean stopped singing. No explosion, no grand gesture. He simply walked over to the director, put a gentle hand on his shoulder, and whispered something that no one else could hear. Then he moved to the trembling boy, picked up the fallen microphone stand himself, and said loud enough for everyone to hear, "Clumsy of me, kid. I think I bumped into you. My fault entirely." He absorbed the mistake, claimed the incompetence as his own, because his persona could handle the stumble, but Tommy's dignity couldn't survive it. The director went silent. The rehearsal continued. Dean never mentioned it again. This was the terrible beauty of Dean Martin's gift. He made himself the lightning rod for everyone else's pain, carrying their humiliation invisibly, while convincing the world he was too drunk to care about anything. But every act of protection carved something away from him. Every performance of effortless joy, requiring him to bury his own complexity deeper. The mask was becoming permanent, and somewhere behind the apple juice and the practiced stumbles, the real Dean was slowly disappearing. March 21st, 1987 dawned with the kind of perfect California weather that seems designed to mock tragedy. The sky stretched endless and blue over Los Angeles, the kind of morning that whispers promises about endless possibilities. Dean Martin was on a movie set that day, going through the motions of a role in a forgettable action film. At 70, he was still handsome in that weathered way that made aging look distinguished, but those who knew him well could see something had been missing from his eyes for years. He was performing life the same way he'd performed drunk for decades, hitting his marks with professional precision while his heart remained somewhere else entirely. 200 miles away, his son was preparing for what should have been a routine training flight. Captain Dean Paul Martin, 35 years old and every inch his father's son, was strapping himself into the cockpit of an F-4 Phantom jet at March Air Force Base. Dino Jr., as the family called him, had inherited his father's devastating smile and his mother's fierce determination. He could have coasted forever on the warm current of his father's fame, could have remained the teen idol from Dino, Desi, and Billy, could have lived comfortably in the shadow of the Martin name. Instead, he had chosen the most demanding path possible, earning his wings through discipline and courage, carving his own identity into the unforgiving sky. There is a particular cruelty in the word routine. It suggests safety, predictability, the comfortable rhythm of practiced skill. It hides the razor-thin line between life and death that men like Dino walked every time they climbed into a cockpit. That morning, as he guided his jet toward the San Bernardino Mountains, the weather began to close in. Clouds swallowed the peaks, visibility dropped to nothing. Somewhere over Mount San Gorgonio, in conditions that turned flying from science into prayer, Dino Jr. simply vanished from radar contact. The call reached Dean just after noon, delivered by a production assistant whose face had gone white with the terrible weight of her message. She approached him between takes, her voice barely above a whisper, speaking words that would echo through the rest of his life. "There's been an accident. Your son's plane. Mount San Gorgonio. They're searching." The sentence hung unfinished in the air because Dean had already stopped listening. For perhaps the first time in his professional career, he simply walked away. No explanation to the director, no apology to the crew. He moved with that same casual grace he'd used to exit 1,000 stages, but this time he was walking away from everything. What followed were 3 of the longest days in Dean Martin's life. While search teams combed the snow-covered wilderness of the mountain, Dean drove himself to the base of San Gorgonio and waited. He refused company, refused comfort, refused the well-meaning attempts of friends to pull him away. He stood there like a man who believed he could will his son back into existence through sheer force of love and desperation. When they finally found the wreckage, buried under feet of snow, when the confirmation came that there would be no miracle, Dean simply nodded once and walked back to his car. The funeral took place under gray skies that finally matched the occasion. For the first time in 40 years of public life, the mask that had protected Dean Martin through poverty, fame, divorce, and every other wound life could deliver cracked wide open. He stood at the graveside looking like he'd aged 20 years in a week, his famous composure replaced by a terrifying stillness that frightened everyone who loved him. Frank Sinatra stood beside him, gripping his elbow as if Dean might collapse at any moment. Sammy Davis Jr. wept openly. But Dean just stared at the flag-draped coffin with eyes that had gone somewhere far away, somewhere the rest of them couldn't follow. When someone offered the traditional comfort that his son had died serving his country, Dean's response revealed the depth of his devastation. He looked up with those hollow eyes and said simply, "He died, my boy." There was no performance left in him, no protective joke to cushion the blow. The man who had spent his life making everyone else comfortable had finally encountered a pain too deep to disguise. After the last mourner left, after the photographers gave up and went home, Dean remained. He stood alone as the sun set, talking to his son in a voice no one else would ever hear. When he finally walked away from that grave, something fundamental had broken inside him that would never heal. The friends who tried to reach him in the weeks that followed found a man who had simply stopped caring about anything. The king of cool had finally met his match in grief, and for 4 long years, he would retreat into the shadows of his Beverly Hills mansion, his body slowly beginning to mirror the brokenness of his spirit. The 4 years following his son's death had been a slow-motion vanishing act. But by early 1991, Dean Martin's body decided it was time to force the issue. The cough that had started as a persistent annoyance deepened into something that shook his entire frame, a deep, tearing sound that seemed to claw its way up from somewhere dark inside his chest. It followed him home from his increasingly rare appearances, echoing through the empty rooms of his Beverly Hills mansion long after the applause had died. Breathing became a conscious effort, each inhale a negotiation with lungs that were turning to stone. The sterile quietness of the doctor's office in early 1991 had the kind of atmosphere that amplifies bad news. Dean sat in the leather chair across from a physician who had been rehearsing this conversation all morning, searching for gentle words to deliver an ungentlemanly diagnosis. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, the smell of antiseptic thick in the air as the doctor spoke carefully about acute respiratory failure, emphysema that had progressed beyond treatment, kidneys that were surrendering after 7 decades of faithful service. He used soft phrases like palliative care and quality of life, those medical euphemisms deployed when there's nothing left to fix. Dean listened with that same calm expression he'd worn through every crisis of his life, hands folded neatly in his lap as if he were getting notes on a rehearsal. When the doctor finished explaining that there were treatments but no cures, that the road ahead would be short and increasingly difficult, Dean asked only one question: how long? The answer came wrapped in medical uncertainty, but the truth was clear enough: months, maybe a year if he was careful. Then Dean Martin made the decision that would define his final act. He looked at the physician with those famous eyes and said with absolute clarity, "Don't tell anyone. Not his children, not his ex-wives, not the friends who had stood beside him through every other catastrophe." The doctor protested gently, explaining that his family would want to know, would want to help, would want to say goodbye. Dean cut him off with a firmness that allowed no argument. "They've watched me grieve for 4 years. I won't make them watch me die." What the doctor couldn't understand was that this wasn't denial or stubbornness. This was the final expression of a philosophy Dean had learned in a Steubenville barbershop 60 years earlier. You carry your troubles quietly. You don't burden others with what you can handle alone. Dean had spent his entire life being the person people turned to for comfort, for laughter, for the illusion that life could be effortless. A dying Dean Martin would steal that gift from everyone who loved him. So began the most challenging performance of his career. He went home and turned his mansion into a stage set designed to hide a dying man. Oxygen tanks were concealed inside closets, disguised as furniture, their plastic tubes carefully coiled and hidden when visitors were expected. Medical appointments were scheduled during hours when family wouldn't visit. He learned to time his pain medication so he could appear comfortable during the brief windows when his children came by. His housekeeper would help position him on the couch before family arrived, making exhaustion look like relaxation. His driver learned to park in spots that minimized the distance Dean had to walk. When his daughter Deanna noticed he'd lost weight, Dean blamed it on golf and getting more exercise. When his son Richie spotted medical equipment partially hidden in a closet, Dean laughed it off as something for a little breathing problem, nothing serious. At La Famiglia restaurant, the staff watched him struggle to finish meals, saw how he had to pause to catch his breath between bites, but they honored his unspoken request for normalcy, becoming guardians of his secret. In March 1991, Dean walked onto the stage at Bally's Casino, knowing full well he was dying. He stood under those hot lights, his lungs burning with every note, his body screaming for rest, and he sang anyway. He made the impossible look easy one last time, protecting the audience from the knowledge that they were watching a ghost say goodbye. When he walked off that stage for the final time, he had pulled off the ultimate deception. He went back to his empty house, alone in the dark, carrying his burden so no one else would have to. It was the loneliest thing he had ever done, and the most heroic. The walls of the Beverly Hills mansion seemed to grow closer with each passing month, transforming the sprawling estate that had once hosted legendary parties into a fortress of solitude, where Dean Martin fought his most private battle. Between 1991 and 1995, while the world outside continued spinning and Vegas grew brighter and louder, inside Dean's world time had slowed to the rhythm of labored breathing and the careful rationing of energy the way he had once rationed punchlines. Most days began in the same leather chair by the window in his bedroom, because lying flat had become impossible without drowning in his own fluid-filled lungs. He slept there more often than in his bed, head tilted slightly back, the soft hiss of hidden oxygen equipment providing a mechanical lullaby. The housekeeper would find him in the mornings, blankets tucked around him, television still flickering with whatever old western he'd tried to watch before exhaustion pulled him under. Before entering, she would pause and listen, counting the seconds between his breaths, measuring time by the fragile rhythm of a man refusing to admit he was running out of it. When his children called to say they were coming over, Dean would transform with the same discipline he had once used to perform drunkenness. These visits became the most demanding performances of his career, more challenging than any live television broadcast. Before they arrived, he would summon strength from reserves that doctors would have sworn he didn't possess. His housekeeper would help him shower and dress, trading pajamas for slacks and a fresh shirt, combing his hair with trembling hands that steadied only when family was watching. He would position himself on the couch at the exact angle that made exhaustion look like relaxation, hiding oxygen tubes and ensuring any visible medical equipment was explained away as precautionary. When Deanna walked through the door, the years would fall away for a moment. "Hey, kid," he'd say, the old warmth in his tone even if his breath caught halfway through. If she noticed he'd lost weight, he'd blame it on getting more exercise. If she commented on medical equipment, he'd wave it off with a joke. "You look tired, Dad," she would say, her eyes scanning his thinning face for clues she was afraid to find. "Just getting old, sweetheart," he'd reply with a wink that cost him everything. "Takes a lot of energy being this good-looking." They would laugh, relieved, because they wanted to believe him. They needed to believe him, and he loved them enough to let them. His household staff became his silent supporting cast, sworn to a secrecy that broke their hearts daily. They watched the man who had charmed the world struggle to walk from his bedroom to the kitchen. They helped him hide oxygen concentrators moments before the doorbell rang, saw him sleeping upright night after night, his head lolling forward in fitful, interrupted sleep. They made excuses when friends called, explaining that Mr. Martin was resting or not feeling up to visitors when in truth he was sitting in that same chair, breathing carefully, staring at photographs of a life that felt like it had belonged to someone else. When they begged him to tell his family, to let people help, to stop carrying this impossible weight alone, Dean's response was always the same. "They've suffered enough because of me. Let them remember me strong." On the rare nights he felt capable, he would venture to La Famiglia, the small Italian restaurant where the staff treated him like a beloved uncle rather than a legend. They noticed how he ate less with each visit, how the fork lingered halfway to his mouth as he fought for breath, how his once booming laugh had turned into a softer, thinner sound that seemed to cost him something each time he let it out. But they never hovered, never fussed. They placed an extra cushion behind his back, walked a little slower when approaching his table, let him be Dean Martin rather than a dying man for one more plate of pasta he could barely swallow. As Christmas 1994 approached, Dean seemed to sense that the final curtain was drawing near. He broke with tradition in a way that was both subtle and devastating. Instead of the usual lavish gifts, he gave each of his children a cassette tape. Sitting alone in his room, he recorded himself singing their favorite songs, pouring whatever strength remained into those melodies. For Diana, everybody loves somebody. For Ricci, that's amor. For each child, a specific track that carried decades of shared memory. His voice cracked with emotion they would only understand later. He wrapped them carefully, wrote notes in handwriting that had become shaky but was still legible, and handed them out on Christmas morning with a smile that required every ounce of his remaining strength. His children listened, touched by the gesture, but unaware they were holding his goodbye in their hands. They heard a father singing. He was singing them a requiem. The physical reality of that final year was brutal beyond imagination. His kidneys were failing, his lungs were stiffening into useless tissue, and his body was essentially starving itself. Eating became an ordeal requiring planning and patience, each meal a negotiation between hunger and nausea. Yet he refused hospitalization, refused to be hooked up to machines that would prolong an existence he no longer recognized. The loneliness was absolute. He had spent his entire life surrounded by people, performing for crowds, part of the most famous group of entertainers in history. Now he sat alone in the dark, his only companions the machines keeping him alive, and the memories of a son he would never stop grieving. On Christmas morning 1995, Dean woke, struggling for every breath. The air felt thin and useless. His kidneys had finally shut down completely. The doctor, summoned urgently to the house, took one look at his condition and said it was time for the hospital, that there might still be a chance with aggressive intervention. He expected fear, expected a fight for survival. Instead, Dean looked back with eyes that were tired but completely clear. He shook his head slowly and whispered just one word. No. No more hospitals. No more pretending. No more fighting a war that was already over. Because somewhere deep in his failing heart, he still believed what his father had taught him on a cold Steubenville street 70 years earlier. A man carries his troubles quietly. You don't burden others with what you can handle alone, even if handling it alone means dying that way. He had protected everyone for as long as he could. Now finally, he would allow himself to rest. The stillness of Christmas morning settled over Los Angeles like a benediction, the city wrapped in that rare quiet that comes only on the holiest of days. Inside Cedars Sinai Medical Center, in a modest room where machines hummed their mechanical prayers, Dean Martin drew his final breath at 3:30 in the morning on December 25, 1995. Even in death, he had managed one last piece of perfect timing. The man who had spent his life bringing joy to the world chose to leave it on the day dedicated to peace and new beginnings, ensuring that his passing would forever be linked with celebration rather than sorrow. The King of Cool had choreographed his own exit with the same attention to other people's comfort that had defined every performance of his 78 years. When his children gathered in the days that followed, they expected to mourn their father's death. They were not prepared to discover they had been mourning a ghost for years. As they sorted through his Beverly Hills home, the full scope of his deception emerged like evidence of a crime of love. Medical records dating back to 1991, prescription bottles hidden in sock drawers, receipts from oxygen suppliers carefully filed away, a journal in his increasingly shaky handwriting, documenting symptoms, medications, and the daily choreography required to hide a dying body behind a living smile. The final entry, written just 3 days before his death, contained only 4 words that shattered them completely. "Let them remember me singing." Deanna sat in her father's chair, holding pages of his careful planning, and felt her heart break in an entirely new way. "We were devastated," she would later say, her voice catching on the words. Not just because he was gone, but because he'd suffered alone for so long. "We would have been there. We would have held his hand through every moment." But Dad didn't want that. He wanted us to remember him strong. Every joke about getting old, every dismissive wave when they worried about his cough, every reassuring smile when they asked if he was okay, had been an act of protection more demanding than any movie role he had ever played. The funeral drew legends from across Hollywood, but the atmosphere carried a grief that went deeper than celebrity. Frank Sinatra arrived looking ancient, his own health failing, leaning heavily on his daughter's arm. When asked to speak, his famous voice cracked with an emotion audiences had never heard. "Dean was the bravest man I ever knew," he managed, each word seeming to cost him something. Not because he wasn't afraid, but because he never let his fear touch anyone else. He carried the weight, so we didn't have to. That's not just friendship, that's love. In the weeks that followed, letters began arriving that revealed the true scope of Dean's secret life. A hospital administrator came forward with records showing Dean had anonymously paid for children's surgeries when parents couldn't afford them. A struggling actor shared how Dean had quietly covered his rent for a year, swearing him to secrecy. A widow revealed monthly checks that had arrived without explanation after her husband, a former crew member, had died. Hundreds of people emerged with stories of a man who had given away fortunes without ever seeking credit, who had used his power to protect the vulnerable while practicing a radical kindness that he kept as hidden as his pain. The pattern became impossible to ignore, and suddenly the world understood who Dean Martin really was. His silence about his terminal illness wasn't stubbornness or pride. It was entirely consistent with how he had lived every single day, carrying weight so others didn't have to, swallowing his struggles whole so the people around him could keep dancing. That night at Bally's in 1991, when his voice cracked and his hand trembled on the microphone stand, when the mask slipped for just one heartbreaking moment before he steadied himself and finished the song, we were witnessing something more profound than entertainment. We were watching a dying man choose grace over honesty, choose our comfort over his own truth, choose to make his final exit look effortless even though every breath was agony. Dean Martin died the way he lived, asking for nothing, giving everything, protecting everyone he loved from the weight of his breaking heart. The King of Cool wasn't cool because he didn't care. He was cool because he cared so devastatingly much that he spent his entire life hiding it, making his love invisible so it wouldn't burden anyone else. That's not just cool, that's love made immortal.